There's nothing Magic players like more than talking about bans and restrictions. So today, we're going back to an old favorite. Which vintage cards should be unrestricted? Welcome back, vintage gamers. It has been a long time since you've seen this screen on my computer, but with Magic Online currently suffering from server ISP issues, canceling all of the weekend's challenges, I am left with no ability to record gameplay. So, I will always pick the lowest hanging fruit, and I'm going to give the people what they asked for. Well, at least some people. And I'm going to do an unrestriction tier list for vintage. Unrestrictions are a big topic in the community because most recently, Wizards has stated and shown through their actions in Modern that unrestrictions are now a new path forward for Eternal formats in terms of upping engagement, rejuvenating player bases with nostalgia, and I think among many others that vintage is a perfect place to start unrestricting a bunch of cards. So what I'm going to do today is we're going to go through the tier we're going to go through the entire restricted list. Not going to go through the ban list or anything, and I'm going to place these cards in a few different categories. We're going to try a different set of categories this time. I'm going to have the big category on the bottom, which is no, cards that I don't think should be unrestricted at all, no matter what. I'm going to have 4 other categories above it, yeses and nos, and ones that are safe or risky. The reason I'm going to do it this way is because this is my tier list. The things that I look for in a card to be unrestricted may be different than what you want in a card to be unrestricted, and that's going to be the case for anyone who ever discusses a ban restriction tier list. For me, what I'm looking for are cards that are fun to the most people, cards that will help balance the format, and cards that don't pose too much of a risk in terms of dominating the format. Now, there's a lot of contradictions and things that can occur when you start to do this, and I'm sure this list will have those as well. You have to just be aware that some cards interact with other cards on this list. So if you do them at the same time, they become, safe or risky depending on when you don't do them. Cards on this list will interact with cards that currently exist in the format, sometimes in very favorable ways, sometimes in unfavorable ways. Sometimes time has passed them by and they are no longer an issue. There's a lot of things and there's a lot of nuance to each and everything. And of course, you can rip me apart in the comments because that is the point of these videos. I will probably be nuanced on each and every take and say whether I think the unrestriction would come with risks and the time frame in which you want to accept those risks. One of the cool parts about vintage is that it's mostly played online and in full proxy, so you actually can ignore things like card price. You can ignore things like decks costing a certain amount of money to build and unbuild, because for the most part, with the Magic Online rental system and paper proxying, you can take apart decks and put together decks no problem. And with the majority of play being online, you can do little test runs. You can say, unrestricted card that may be very unsafe, but try it for a month on Magic Online. If it becomes clear that this card is too good, too dominant, you can then just re-restrict the card. This is not something you can really do in formats like Modern, because of people who are buying into the decks and then losing their decks when the restrictions or a card gets unbanned, rebanned. In Vintage, I think there's a very high tolerance for something like that with the current setup for how Vintage is played, and we'll talk about that as we go through individual cards here. So I hope you all enjoy this unrestriction tier list. All right, let's get started right away and do something very clean and easy. I don't think having some or any number of fast mana unrestricted makes for the same format as Vintage. Vintage is very specifically and historically, where these fast mana rocks are all restricted. So it's very easy to quickly just put Black Lotus, Mox, 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 Mana Crypt, Soul Ring into this no category. Now, could you unrestrict them? Yes, but what that format would be wouldn't be Vintage. It would be some other format. And it's totally worth trying out that format, but that's not really what the purpose of this video is going to be. So let's just go one by one through these now as we check out combo pieces and restrictive pieces. Let's start with these restrictive pieces here. Trinisphere. I think with Mishra's Workshop existing in the format as a 4 of, and it should always exist in the format as a 4 of. I think that's kind of by definition what Vintage is now. You can never really have Trinisphere unrestricted again. You want players to be able to engage in playing Magic, and based on the rules of engagement for what they have already put down, being Wizards of the Coast has already put down in their most recent announcement about Vexing Bauble, cards like Trinisphere are going to stay sparse, and they can still happen. You can still go workshop Trinisphere, but it won't happen in a large amount of games. So it's just going to be up here as a no for me. Merchant Scroll. Merchant Scroll is an interesting one because it's a 2-mana tutor, and the cards it tutors for are not always great outside of Ancestral Recall. Like, once you start getting outside of Ancestral Recall, you're usually less happy about what you're tutoring for. You can tutor for cards like Gush, Dig Through Time, Brainstorm, all cards that are actually on this restricted list. But as long as those cards are restricted and you're not being able to build around them, it doesn't seem like Merchant Scroll would be a huge problem. Now, maybe being able to cast Ancestral Recall in too many games is too much. I wouldn't think so. But I could see things like, say they were to unrestrict Flash, and now you have Merchant Scroll and Flash together. See, that's a huge problem. As it stands, lots of decks are not choosing to play Merchant Scroll. There's not a lot of gushing happening in the format. Full Moxen decks still will always try to play their one Merchant Scroll. PO decks love to play their one Merchant Scroll, like true PO decks, not workshop PO decks. I don't even think this is risky. And I don't see any reason it's not worth trying. Now, if you play this out and there's like tons of Ancestral games and every game is decided by Ancestral, then yeah, I see that as a problem. But I would put this card as safe, and I would unrestrict it, or at least try to unrestrict it. I think that's an important qualifying point. And I will do these in order. Besides this bottom one, I'll do these in order so that the most safe and the one I want the most will be on the far left. Chalice of the Void, again with Workshop, just makes for games of Magic that do not get played. And I do think that in terms of how Wizards sees fun in the format, one player being restrictive of the other person's fun seems to weigh heavier on them than one player just comboing and winning. Now, that is obviously very subjective opinion on how players enjoy the games, but they are definitely more likely to go about stopping players who are doing the extreme prison style gameplay. So it's going to be a no here for this Chalice, but for I think fairly obvious reasons. Flash is now this is a kind of card that's a very interesting topic. This is a card that prior to the imprinting of Atraxa, I would have said an easy unrestriction, because I don't believe that flashing for a Protean Hulk into a combo is a good, consistent play worth trying for in Vintage. I believe that is not a... I think if Atraxa didn't exist and Flash was a 4 of, I don't think the Flash deck would dominate the format. Playing a bunch of cards that are quite bad on their own is a real restriction. And you can see that in things like Oops All Spells and there's no Cephalid Breakfast deck. And this Flash deck would be very similar to those decks in how it wins and how it approaches the game. With that being said, the printing of Atraxa makes me think that Flash, it would be far too good. Flash is already one of the single best cards in the Show and Tell Oath deck. Being able to play a bunch of Flashes instead of a bunch of Show and Tells would be an extreme upgrade to the Oath deck. I don't know exactly how the build would pan out. Would you be on like 1 Show and Tell, 4 Flashes? Would you even be doing Oath things? Probably. All I can say is I think that deck would be extremely powerful. I truly believe that Flash Atraxa is much, much better than Show and Tell Atraxa. And to that point, I now no longer really feel that Flash is acceptable to introduce to the format. That being said, if you were to risk it for a month, I think that'd be pretty fun. I would be very interested in seeing the Flash Atraxa deck be played out, and I could always be wrong, right? I'm open to the idea that that's a misevaluation. However, as it stands, I'm going to say no and a very risky unrestriction. Brainstorm. So this is actually a completely safe unrestriction. However, it is an unrestriction that you will never see it occur. And the reason you'll never see it occur is because Eternal formats have their own identity. They're doing something and giving Magic players opportunities to play a game in a certain way. And while Brainstorm is a busted card, and maybe even it would be like extremely good in Vintage as a 4 of, Legacy is the place to play Brainstorm. Brainstorm is already too good for Legacy, but they keep it in Legacy because that is where you play Brainstorm. You can't play Brainstorm in Vintage, but you can play Brainstorm in Legacy. And so as long as Legacy remains the Brainstorm format, Vintage will always have Brainstorm restricted. So while this is probably a safe one, I'm actually going to put it down here in the no column. And it's not because of its power level, it's because of format identity, which is an important factor in a ban and restriction list. Dig through time. Dig through time. Dig through time is very interesting because it's clearly extremely good and would be extremely good if unrestricted. But I still don't know how many dig through times you can actually play in your deck and have it still function. Maybe there's this like heavy cantrip based combo deck that I am not sure of. Maybe you could just get to play. Maybe every deck that had a treasure cruise has 2 dig times instead now. Maybe you can afford to do other things. I feel that with the current state of Vintage, in terms of power and speed, I do have a hard time believing that 4x delve spells is broken. Now, that's a famous last words. But that is how I feel. I don't think I would release Dig Through Time in the beginning. But I don't think it's a crazy idea to say that you could have cruises or Dig Through Times and have them exist as more of in the format. That being said, like I always said 2.5 graveyard delve spells between Yawgmoths, Cruise and Dig was the number, and Snapcaster Mage. Snapcaster being like a 0.5, and then you could probably play like 2 delve spells or a delve spell and a Yawg was always like kind of the limit you could play in the PO decks. But the PO deck is not a deck that tries very hard to put cards in the graveyard, and you could try a lot harder. You could do, I don't know, you could do things like Dragon Rage Channelers and Thought Scourers and Baubles and those kind of things. That being said, those cards are typically less powerful, so they would have to be made up for by the sheer power level of of the Dig Through Times, and it's definitely possible that that would be extremely good. I don't think Dig is on my short list to be unrestricted, but I am going to just put it inside of the no too risky category here. I don't think it's unreasonable to say at some point in life you could maybe try to unrestrict delve spells. That being said, it depends kind of on the cards that get printed between now and that time. Like if you end up with more, Bauble style cards that are quite good, then this card gets better. But those kind of cards are very hard to print, so it's something to think about. Mind's Desire is a contentious one because it was released into the Legacy format and has had no impact on the format. I think people forget that Vintage is the format of Black Lotus and Moxes. The power of Mind's Desire in Vintage is significantly higher than in Legacy, to the point where it becomes extremely risky to have 4 Mind's Desires. Because if you are able to cast the first Mind's Desire, especially if you're casting it on the first turn before something like Flusterstorm is available, it's highly likely your Mind's Desire will hit another Mind's Desire. Not highly likely, but it's decently likely your Mind's Desire hits another Mind's Desire, hits another Mind's Desire, plays through your whole deck and wins on the spot. Now, it is not easy to hit 6 mana, including double blue on turn 1. I know we hit 6 mana in Workshop Salt on turn 1, but that's because of Workshop, right? So it's extremely risky. I do think a lot of people underestimate how risky it is to have Desire. That being said, I would give it a try. I would say, let's see what happens. 6 is a lot of mana. Flusterstorm and Mindbreak Trap both exist. Any deck can play Mindbreak Trap. I'm skeptical that a Desire deck will be able to consistently go off on the first turn of the game. It feels like it's more likely to be a second turn of the game. At that point, you have lots of ways to interact with it. I do think it's risky. So I would probably put this on a very short leash. I would try it for a month, see what it looks like on Magic Online, but I would put yes, and I would put risky. Ponder, that's funny. Ponder actually has already come off the restricted list by the time of this video. I made this tier list a few years ago now. So while I did include the newest restricted cards, I did not include the unrestriction of Ponder on here. So it's quite funny. But yeah, Ponder has ended up being not an incredibly large factor after being unrestricted. It did buff Doomsday, gave Doomsday a little bit more cantrip power, and it did, I think, give an option and tool to decks like PO and Tinker in terms of trying to glue those decks together with some number of 2 to 4 Ponders. That still hasn't really come to fruition because of the power of Luris decks kind of holding Tinker back. But Ponder has been a very reasonable inclusion. Treasure Cruise is very similar to Dig Through Time, except I believe the card is a lot worse than Dig Through Time. The thing that Dig Through Time is doing has always been a bit more powerful. It is a lot harder with double blue. And there are lots and lots of ways to punish Treasure Cruise. That being said, it is easier to cast Treasure Cruise, especially in your multiple Moxen deck. I'm going to just put it under no risky, but I could see it being under no safe. The line there is pretty close. And all things considered, I wouldn't want to do that. Vampiric Tutor. Vampiric Tutor. Now, like, Vampiric Tutor is a card that is powerful, but of the top deck tutors, being black, yeah, I just don't think you want to end up in a world where you have unrestricted tutor like this. And I also think that it's somewhat part of the format's identity to restrict tutors like this. But I don't feel like it's crazy or anything. I would simply put Vampiric Tutor and Mystical Tutor underneath the no risky category. But I could definitely see these are not good cards, is what I'm trying to say. Playing a mana to manipulate the top card of your library is not a good card. But the power level of the cards you can get and put on top of your library make it a good enough card. Do Tinker decks play 4 of these if it is unrestricted? Probably. I think so. You do, put yourself all in, but putting yourself all in for Tinker Citadel is worth it. Most of the time, I would say. So I'm going to put those there in no risky. Balance. Balance is a card I have heard about people floating, and let me tell you, you don't want to live in that world. The number of Moxen that exist in Vintage make for just crazy, crazy balance swings that are only fun for one player. And I really think that balance as more of this tech card that you board in for creature heavy metas as like the multiple Moxen deck that you can tutor for to save you from a large swath of creatures is a much healthier and more interesting way to have balance in the format. I think the current existence of one balance is really, really fun and interesting, but when you get 4 balances, you end up with extremely degenerate decks and degenerate play patterns that I think would make for not a very good format. I'm just gonna put it into no risky. Monastery Mentor. So this is a very interesting one, and this is one that I am thinking about advocating for as one of the possible unrestrictions. Now, I do think it's a risky level unrestriction because Monastery Mentor is an extremely powerful card and has shown to be very broken in Vintage in the past. That being said, parts of the reasons why Monastery Mentor was extremely broken in the past were Gitaxian Probes and Gush, these free spells that are definitely restricted right now. So you do have some power in Monastery Mentor with, Moxen shells, with PO shells, with Tinker shells, of course, still with cantrip-based shells, but I think it's in line with what's currently going on in the format, and one of the biggest reasons you would want to theoretically unrestrict Mentor is because of the current situation in the format. Right now, playing blue, you are most of the time playing Lurrus. You have to kind of play Lurrus to make sure that you keep up with the other Lurrus players. And I think that's kind of sad. It'd be nice to have more options outside of that. The Tinker decks are not bad, but they could use a little boost. 2, 3 mentors, I don't know, maybe 4 mentors in that deck might be enough reason for you to opt out of playing Lurrus and into some kind of Monastery Mentor shell. If it was too good, I think it would be a problem, though. If you have everyone abandoning Lurrus to play Monastery Mentor, that would be quite amazing. It'd be very, it'd be eye-opening for me. But is Mentor producing more interesting games than Lurrus? I would say probably not. That being said, it is one of the pair of cards here that I think makes the most sense to give players options that include for blue decks that are not Lurrus. Now, you don't have to do that. There's no reason that you have to try to diversify the blue decks outside of Lurrus, because even inside of Lurrus, there's lots of different ways to play Lurrus decks. Combo control, I think it's still pretty unexplored. Different versions of Lurrus control and different versions of Lurrus combo. I think something like a Jeskai Arcanist or a Grixis Arcanist Frog versions of Lurrus control are way underexplored. I don't know why people are not trying those kind of things. I do think the combo decks of the format are still extremely unexplored, like breaching and POing and wheeling inside of Lurrus as well. So I don't really feel like Lurrus is restrictive in the way... I don't think Lurrus is restrictive in terms of keeping blue decks down or even the ways you can play blue decks. Simply, you're not allowed to play Tinker Citadel, Mentor, Narset, Dak Faden, some of these other cards, but they're not really that many cards that cost 3 mana that are really worth playing. A lot of your best cards in Magic are going to cost under 2 anyways, so it's like kind of it's a weird spot where you don't have to do anything, but it'd be interesting to maybe try. So for me, Narset and another card I'll talk about later are going to be under this. Narset is sorry, Mentor is going to be under yes risky, and I guess what I'll say is Narset is the other card I want to talk about under that kind of guise, that kind of 3 drops. The format in which Narset was restricted in is very different from today's world. The format when Narset was restricted in was extremely spell-based, extremely stack-based. The number of creatures in the format was very low. It was just a different format. And at the time, Narset was very, very hampering to a variety of blue decks, and even Vine-based Bazaar decks, those kind of things. And it was very not fun. It was also new, and people were really adverse about planeswalkers with static effects. People were not very happy with its introduction, the same way they weren't very happy with like when Lavinia was introduced and other cards like that. I think the sentiment on Narset has basically shifted. You don't really see very many decks with Narset in it anyways, even among the decks that do choose to forgo Lurrus, then play things like Tinker. Sometimes you don't even end up with Narset in those decks. Narset is very hard to protect against the current swath of creature decks in the format. With Mono White Initiative being a huge function of the format, you don't really want a Narset in your deck for that. Even then, the Lurrus deck, which is one of the decks that is the blue decks, is not drawing a lot of cards, and the cards they are drawing can be off of Bauble on your turn, and they have tons of creatures to hit Narset. And when you hit with a frog and kill a Narset, you're still gonna draw a card, which is like really super super crazy. So I think Narset is actually a card that has greatly reduced in power level, one because of meta shifts, and two just because of the way the format, or just in general, I think. So I would say Narset and Mentor are my two biggest choices for blue cards that could theoretically push you out of Luris. Where Narset is probably very safe. Maybe people wouldn't like it as much because it is kind of, restricted around in terms of fun. But I think in terms of power level, it's not really matching up to what I would think would be the power level of the format at the moment. So the Narset Mentor pair are two cards that I would like to see unrestricted, with Mentor being the far more risky option of the two. I don't know how we made it this far in the video without the other power getting put inside of this no category, but let me quickly put Ancestral Recall, Time Walk over here. I guess we'll let Twister sit, and we'll talk about Twister later too. Yeah. Let's just throw those in there real quick as we move forward here. Channel. I don't believe that Channel is risky. I actually think Channel would be bad. I don't believe the card is strong enough to make its own archetype in Vintage that is consistently powerful and can beat out the other decks in the format, especially with the introduction of Force of Negation into the format in that Modern Horizons set. I do feel like Channel would be fun. People would try it. People would be interested in trying it, and they would put a lot of eyes into the format and have people trying out the card, which I think is one of the primary reasons to do unrestrictions are these kind of PR efforts and boosts in visibility. So for me, I believe that Channel is safe and that Channel should be unrestricted for fun and for enjoyment, basically. Now, Channel resolving and winning the game is definitely a one-sided fun kind of thing, but I think it's a green spell, and it's worth chasing because of this power level, even if it's not going to be super strong. And these like one-off cool combo decks that are not super strong, I think are worthy additions into the Vintage format. Necropotence. That's an interesting one. It's one that I've actually floated between I've floated the idea of Necro being unrestricted before. It is by far the worst thing to do with your triple black mana in your Doomsday deck. That being said, it is a thing worth doing in your Doomsday deck. And the fact that it gets around draw spells is still really good. I don't believe having... So the problem I'm having is, are there other Necro decks that would play the card that are not Doomsday? Are there like fair decks that would try to there's been a player in the past who played Bug and had Necro in it. I was never really impressed with the Necro inside of Bug. So like you're really you're pigeonholing Necro into two decks. I would assume a Doomsday based deck and a Storm based deck. We've not really seen any Storm based decks in Vintage in quite some time. Since like before the printing of Pio, I would say. It's very hard to build a Storm deck that lets you play Force of Will and still be extremely effective. The stack interaction right now is very, very strong with negations and Flusterstorms. I don't really see for Necro putting a Storm-based deck back on the map, and I don't know what Necro does besides like allow Doomsday more deck building choices. Maybe it makes Doomsday more combo oriented if you played a bunch of Necros in it. I don't see Doomsday is down a deck in the Vintage that needs buff as well. So if we're not introducing like a whole new deck to the format with Necro, which I don't think you would be, all you're doing is buffing Doomsday, then I don't really see the point. And even then it might, even if like the best case scenario is it's actually not good to add more Necros into Doomsday, then it just doesn't do anything. And I'm not really sure it engages people in the same way that Channel does, but maybe I'm wrong in that. And now that I think about that, give it a second thought. Maybe the glory and idea of producing a Necro Storm deck makes it worth trying, like Channel. Okay, so like if I'm using my own logic here, that's what I'm saying. Like you're gonna have some amount of contradiction. Maybe I'm contradicting myself in the fact that I think Channel is a safe. So the problem is that is Dark Ritual is definitely a thing that Necro has that Channel does not have, right? I'm trying to figure out if it's worth... Because I have a Mind's Desire and yes, risky. So maybe we try a Necro too. Maybe you don't put those two at the same time is another thing. I'm trying to figure out if I want to do like no safe or yes risky. And how does that vibe? Like, do I feel like a 4 Necro deck is going to break the format? Do I feel like 4 Necros in Vintage would be very good and better than it currently is? I don't. I don't feel like it would be. But I do feel like you would play more Necros. Is that a weird place to be? Where I feel like maybe you'd play 2 Necros or something in Doomsday? I don't know. I have no idea. I think I'm just gonna put it in no risky, but like the least risky. I don't know if that's the exact order of those kind of things. Am I doing the least risky on the left or the most risky? I think it'd be the order in which I would unrestrict them, maybe is the way we'll do it. So I want to do this. Like this, and then like this, and then like this. Yeah, we'll try that. I don't know. Let me know what you think about Necropotence in the comments below. I would love to hear some opinions, because I have heard very divisive thoughts regarding Necro. Gush is a no. Gush has been tried and is not a healthy play pattern for Vintage. Don't listen to what any of the boomers say. If you want to play Gush, there are other formats which you can play Gush. Vintage is not the Gush format, and hopefully will never be. Now, that's probably going to spark some things. Like, I just don't think that it's really worth trying again. Am I convinced that there would be a Gush deck? Yeah, I think there would be a Gush deck, and I think it would be good. Do I think it would be broken? I'm not 100% sure. But, yeah, not super interested. Windfall. Windfall is a card that I don't think is powerful enough. I would unrestrict Windfall. I don't think Windfall would see any play, even as a 4 of. And if it did see play, I don't feel like the deck would be good. Yes, you can build even more Hull Breachers, Wheel Twisters things, but those decks don't even play the first Windfall. Like, does having 4 Windfalls give you a high enough chance to pull off the Hull Breacher combo? Maybe, but I'm not worried about it. Windfall would be a card that I would unrestrict. Probably not. I do have Narset and Windfall next to each other, which I think is quite funny. Narset would make Windfall better. I don't think it would make it better enough though. So Thorn, it's time. Thorn can come off. Thorn is not a card on power level that is too good for the format. Thorn is a byproduct of a combination of workshop cards that were too strong for the format that they were restricted in. Workshop's power level was sufficiently reduced, and over time it has only gotten weaker. There were some times where there were viable anti-meta workshop decks, especially at the end of the Saga era, when you had Vexing, Bauble, and 4 Saga, and your Golos deck was very good against Luris. That being said, that time has passed, and Workshop, at least traditional Mud Workshops, has failed to grasp the current metagame power level. And do I think Thorn will change that? Not necessarily, no. But I would rather have these weak cards that were restricted, not really on the basis of their own, but on the basis of the power of the deck that they were in. I'd like those cards to come off the restriction list, so that we have as many tools to use as we can. Mystic Forge is a card that has not gotten weaker. It has only gotten stronger, as evidenced by Legacy and even modern decks. Glaring Fleshraker, especially in Sensei's top, these cards are all going to make Mystic Forge broken, and anytime it's in the format. And that's without the idea of Workshop existing. And with Workshop existing, Mystic Forge is nowhere close to the reasonable power level to have unrestricted in Vintage. Some people might tell you differently, but I think Forge is a card that has only gotten better and will continue to get better. And with Workshop in the format, not a card you're allowed to have as a 4 of. Demonic Consultation. I don't want this card unrestricted. I believe it is far too good. And even though it has killed me, Thassa's Oracle really, really pushes this one over the edge. You don't really see Demonic Consultation used in other 4X combo decks. Maybe that would not be as... I mean, the fact that Thassa's Oracle exists means I don't think you can ever have Demonic Consultation unrestricted. 4 Oracle, 4 Consult, all blue, broken card deck is too good for the format. So, a no. Straight up no. Imperial Seal. This is going to be a yes and a safe for me. No one in the format plays the first Imperial Seal. The first Imperial Seal is notably very bad. It's even been tried to play in the past in various like Esper Tinker decks by notable players, but even then, it's still pretty bad. And I don't think having access to 4 of it would change anything significantly to the point where it's kind of just another card that is restricted because it was old and powerful and, you know, is similar to these cards, but we are in 2025. Imperial Seal can come off the list. Ooh, Lodestone Golem, another card that has been floated by some boomers as a way to revive shops. And let me tell you, this would not revive shops. This would make shops incredibly, incredibly strong. Lodestone Golem is by far the best restrictive piece in workshops because it is also a clock. The biggest problem with a card, the biggest problem with cards like Sphere and Thorn is that while they slow your opponent down, they do nothing to end the game. So if your opponent can come out from underneath the lock, then they didn't really do anything. Lodestone is a restrictive piece that also just wins the game on its own. 5 power is incredible. And yes, it can be lightning bolted. No, there are no lightning bolts in the format. Yes, it can be swords to plowshares. And no, it doesn't affect Moxen. So yeah, there are a bunch of drawbacks to it. But as a 4 of, Lodestone Golem would be the most powerful lock piece in the shops deck for all the reasons I've already stated. It is far too risky to give shops that kind of tool. Let's start with Thorn and some other cards like it, and we'll go from there. I put Lodestone inside of the risky camp, but I, not like super high in the no risky camp. I feel like it's, somewhere between, it's kind of similar to like unlocking delve spells or maybe it's like a little less powerful than Flash, something like that. Like it's not crazy. And if you really, I think there is a push to make Workshop a viable archetype in Vintage, like a Mud Workshop deck a viable archetype in Vintage. That's like your last resort. Like pull the break the glass emergency Lodestone Golem. Gitaxian Probe and Mental Misstep, I'm going to do these both at the same time. These are horrendously designed Magic cards that should never have been printed and are completely broken. Looking at your opponent's hand for free is absurd and makes Magic less fun for everyone. It ruins like one of the best parts of Magic, which is hidden information and trying to figure out how to make the best play with the information that you have. Taking all that away is very, 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 very lame. And then, of course, it breaks other cards like Delve and that kind of, and Monastery Mentor and those kind of things. Mental Misstep, very much the same in that a free counter spell that only hits, itself. It hits itself and hits Ancestral, and it's just abysmal play patterns that are not fun. There are some blue-loving boomers who will tell you that unrestricted Mental Misstep will be fun for the format. It's not. It reduces deck building space. It is just very, very poor for everyone involved. So we can very easily not have those 2 cards. Lotus Petal was a card in the past that I was thinking maybe wasn't as risky as people thought. But I don't really believe that anyway nowadays, especially with Luris existing. If you think that like turn 1 Lavinias and Frogs are bad now, if you have 4 petals, you will soon learn the meaning of pain for when it comes to 2 different pip oppressive creatures on turn 1. I know that Luris decks don't always play the petal right now, but I think that's just crazy to me. Obviously, it's card disadvantage, but if you bring it back with Luris, and if you get a Frog down, you're immediately recouping. It's very, very strong, and I think it has actually gotten stronger with the introduction of those kind of cards. Tinker as well. Tinker is a broken magic card, especially in combination with Bolas' Citadel. The robot portions of Tinker have actually gotten very weak over the course of time. Sphinx of the Steel Wind has got multiple reasonable answers to it. Blaze of Colossus is basically unplayable, especially with the amount of swords that are currently in the format. That being said, tinkering for Bolas' Citadel is still extremely strong and worth building your entire deck around. Tinker can remain as the one of that it is, and you can use, supplement that by playing a bunch of, tutors that put you into a card disadvantage kind of situation. Golgari Grave Troll. Dredge does not need a boost. While Dredge, I think, is actually in a very poor position in the current metagame, it's not always going to be a poor position. It's going to always be related to how much hate people choose to play. The more people play Dredge, the worse Dredge is. The less people play Dredge, the better Dredge is, as people will cut Graveyard Hate from their sideboard. I don't think giving Dredge the best Dredger in the deck back is going to be reasonable. You'll have lots of Dredge and challenges, and I think we already have too much Dredge and challenges as it is. The goal for me in terms of Dredge is always to have it be a viable archetype that you can play, and even a good metagame bullet, but you really want to avoid having Dredge be your best deck in the format. It is extremely polarizing gameplay, and it really, as you've probably seen if you watch any of my videos, it very much makes the game about itself, and so it's always pretty much going to be unfun for the other player, because they don't get to really do the thing that they're trying to do. Instead, they have to just mulligan and find these hate cards in the sideboard. Bazaar Baghdad is not going anywhere. Bazaar Baghdad is here to stay, and I think it's good for a Bazaar Baghdad deck to be good enough to be played. You always really want that. There are lots of players who play Vintage specifically to play Bazaar Baghdad. I don't think they need Golgari Grave Troll to function. And you don't also want to give them more green cards to more reliably cast Force of Vigor. When Force of Vigor is very easily castable out of Dredge, it makes it very hard to combat Dredge, as you get 2-for-1 answered. With Vigor existing and Dredge being in the state it is, I think Golgari Grave Troll is just a no. You could probably put it in no risky, but I think this is a fine place. Mana Vault is definitely the worst of the mana rocks that we've talked about today. But I still don't think that changes its place in terms of what we're talking about. We want these rocks to be restricted. I think the current set of rocks, you probably won't get very many that cards printed that are better than the current set of mana rocks that we have. Keeping them all at one of makes for cleaner gameplay, to the point where you could actually, I think, argue that Grim Monolith might deserve to be on this list of restricted mana rocks. It very much keeps with the theme of what kind of cards are restricted in the format. And if you ever saw a Jewel get too good, besides, restricting a Ring or a Jewel, which might just kill the deck altogether. Maybe a Ring restrict doesn't kill the deck, but makes the deck a lot worse. Something that could be done and that is very on theme for the format is restricting Grim Monolith. I don't want to go too much into restrictions in this video. This is about unrestrictions. But just something to think about is, like, look at the cards that are restricted here in terms of fast mana. Is Grim Monolith so much worse than these cards that it's allowed to be a fine? Yeah, possibly. But maybe not. So Demonic Tutor is going to go inside of this list. I think Demonic Tutor is much stronger than these top deck tutors. And I will just put it in no instead of no risky. I do like tutors being part of that restricted category as well. Yeah, straightforward. Yawgmoths Will. I don't think Yawgmoths Will's too good as more than a one of. Maybe you can build a Storm or Graveyard based combo deck that's more, that's able to use multiple copies of Yawgmoths Will, but I always found the first copy of Yawgmoths Will to be very hard to use. You can really only use it later in the game once you've already cast, besides when you have the broken Black Lotus Ancestral Draw. You can really only use it later in the game when you have a significant number of cards in your yard. And I think that's actually its best use case. I think, like Balance, it being a one of not have decks built around it makes for a more interesting card. That being said, I think I would free it. I'd be interested to see decks that were built around it. I don't think the decks that are built around it would be particularly good in similar ways to Channel. Now, Channel is a green card, so that really, really inhibits Channel's power level, where Yawgmoth is a black card that combos with Dark Ritual. So I think it's risky to unrestrict Yawgmoth, but I don't think there would be like a 4x combo. Maybe there would be a 3x Yawgmoth combo deck. I don't know. I'm willing to give, you know, this one a chance, just kind of like Mind's Desire. And if it's too good, then you just re-restrict it. But I do think that it would be an interesting thing to reintroduce to the format, and I do believe it would be like a really strong PR exploratory kind of move where people would come to the format to try and see if they could break a Yawgmoth deck. So yeah, I would give Yawgmoth its chance. And like I said, it's risky in lots of similar ways to some of these other cards I hear. Wheel of Fortune. So Wheel of Fortune and Time Twister are two cards I'm going to do together. Unlike Windfall, these cards are at the power level where they're good and see play. I don't believe that introducing these cards as a 4 of in the current format would produce really fun things for players. The one-sided Hull Breacher Twister things that happen, and then the compounding, both players are kind of pushed into playing Hull Breachers and Bowmasters and Shieldreds and these kind of combo cards, you know, so that your opponent's Twisters are worse. I just don't think that's going to lead to a format that is going to be very good for the people. I think these cards are just going to be too strong and extremely warping. I would put both Wheel and Twister under this no category. Lion's Eye Diamond is a card that I must admit I don't have a great grasp on how exactly it would affect the format. It's possible that all Lion's Eye based combo decks are bad, but it's also possible that like I'm really extremely underestimating like Killaby style Legacy decks. Those decks don't perform well in Legacy outside of his hands, but the cards that surround a Lion's Eye Diamond, what is the flashback wheel card that he plays? Into the Eons of something. There's a wheel that costs that you can flashback from the graveyard that he combos with his Lion's Eye Diamonds, and I just think that it's better to keep this kind of thing as the one of, for lots of the same reasons that I would keep these other fast mana producing cards as one ofs. Time Vault is a heinous card, and we can already have too many ways to find and put together Vault combos. Time Vault was one of the biggest reasons that I think Saga was too much for people. I think that if Time Vault didn't exist, Saga would be a lot more reasonable in many people's eyes, because yeah, the Suspend Lotus is obviously the best part of it, and constructs are okay, but they're very easily dealt with. Being able to just have tons of access to your Vault Key combo, and the game just ends on the spot in games that you are so far behind in, or this kind of things, mean for really, really feel bad moments. And I do think that the combination of an unblockable Manifold Key and Time Vault and Saga was just a lot. That being said, even on its own right now, you still see people try to put together Time Vault combos, even with one Saga. Time Vault as a one of just makes sense in a similar way that Tinker makes sense. It's very powerful. It's worth trying to build your deck around and put more ways for you to find the pieces for it. But it should stay as a one of that is kind of a goal that you need to reach, or need to put effort in reaching instead of just being right there in front of you. Library of, I keep skipping cards, but we're going to straight to Library of Alexandria. Library, it's time to be freed. Now, Library has obviously a very high price tag, so that would be maybe concerning for paper players that are playing Eternal Weekend. But like I said, I think that with the majority of vintage play happening online and in proxy events, I don't want to use price as a reason to have anything to do with a restriction list. And I think that Vintage is in a spot where you can do that, unlike something like Modern. Library of Alexandria is a card that sees 0 play in Vintage right now, unless your name is Brian Kelly. And it is a card that could be better if there's you have 4 of it, but it is an inherently slow card. Library takes a lot of time for you to accrue your advantage. You're giving up your land drop. Obviously, if you have a bunch of Moxen, you can kind of subvert that a little bit. But with Wasteland being the second most played card in the format, I am skeptical that, and with the current speed of the format, especially with creature decks and combo decks, I am very skeptical that Library of Alexandria is a 4 of changes anything to do with the format, and I would love to see that as Unrestriction. I think it'd be very similar to Channel in the way that it would draw people in and give people reason to come explore the format. Library is a card that has a lot of talk inside of Cube communities on whether it's a highly rated card or it's gotten a lot worse, or that kind of thing. And it's a card people seem to enjoy inside of Cube. I think having Library Unrestricted is very much a driver to expose people to Vintage. So I don't think there would be 4 of Library decks that were actually good, but I would be not super unhappy to be wrong about that. I think if we had a couple interesting Library decks, that would be kind of a cool addition to the format. But currently, I don't have high hopes for a 4 of Library. Memory Jar. This is an interesting one because I don't think Memory Jar is closer to Windfall in terms of power than it is to Twister and Wheel, my opinion. That's not to say that Jar is bad. And I was actually fairly impressed with the recent Jar deck that CRK put together inside of the Fleshraker shop. So with the crawling scrawlers, whatever they're called. The cards that's like an artifact that whenever your opponent draws a card, they take damage. So you actually had some like pretty cool, in very similar style to Shieldred Wheel, Bowmaster Wheel, Hullreacher Wheel. There was like an artifact-based wheel thing. With that existing, I actually would be slightly concerned about Jar as a 4 of, just mostly because of the card Mishra's Workshop. Mishra's Workshop is really, really broken, but I don't think it's I think it's safe to unrestrict Jar, but I don't know if I would do it. This might be the first one that I put in I think the card is safe, but I wouldn't do it. It's definitely better than Windfall, right? Like no one plays Windfall, and some people are still trying Jar decks. You can still tinker for a Jar, but basically no one tinkers for a Jar. You really only see Jar inside of these workshop decks, and maybe those decks are like not that good. You know what? Free the Jar. I'm over it. Let's put it above. It's more interesting than a Merchant Scroll Unrestriction. Yeah, free the Jar. You know what? If Scrawling Crawler Jar is good then I'm okay. I think I'm okay with that. I am a little biased there. I think I do find mud-based combo decks to be very interesting, but I feel like mud-based combo decks are inherently locked out of the fact that they can't play Force. That being said, you did have the Karn Forge deck dominate the format. Would a Jar deck dominate the format in the same way that Karn Forge did? No, I don't think so. Like one of the biggest things about Karn Forge was that it was restrictive, and that the Karn stopped your opponent from doing things. Yeah, I would say Jar is a worthy experiment. Maybe a little risky, but I definitely don't think it's as risky as these ones. So yeah, let's do Jar. Strip Mine. Disgusting to think about. I don't want to ever hear. Like, I want to at least theoretically have the ability to fetch basics to play around how broken Wasteland is. I think Wasteland is closer to being restricted than Strip Mine is to unrestricted. It's very nice to have the ability to fetch basics and sometimes be safe from being Wastelanded. To let that play pattern go would be very unfortunate. Tolarian Academy is simply too good in terms of making mana. It's really hard to justify Academy existing as a 4 of in a space with look how many restricted rocks there are. It's just too strong. And Karn, I think, is the more powerful piece of the Karn Forge broken colorless deck that pillaged that format for a little while. I can't see Karn ever coming off the restriction list. It does a lot of the things that they don't like about Chalice and then Vexing Bauble and those cards, and also is game winning on its own. It's very, very, very strong card. And extremely unfun. You don't really want turn one Karns happening very often. So having it, be restricted kind of like 3-ball makes a lot of sense to me. And now we get to the end. We get to the end of the 2 cards that were recently restricted, Vexing Bauble and Urzas Saga. And I am going to surprise everyone here, and I have found a solid use for my safe, but no. And there's a really easy reason to put these cards in safe, but no. And it's because neither card needed to be restricted in Vintage. Both cards being restricted in Vintage were surprises to me because the Vintage format was wide and balanced, and in my opinion, reasonably fun. And you've already seen post-restriction that basically nothing has changed. Some small play pattern differences, but for the majority of the cases, not a whole lot has changed. If you were to just revert that restriction and go back to that format, all the same decks are still viable, except maybe you actually have a Prison Golos deck come back, which was basically the one deck that actually left the format with the restriction of Bauble and Saga. None of the decks that people thought might come back because of Saga and Bauble being restricted came back. Things like Counter Vine and Hogak Vine and those kind of things. None of that came back. So really, I think you actually gain one more playable deck by putting both of these back in the format. That being said, the reasons behind their restrictions are very reasonable, and I did a whole video on it. Make sure you check that out if you wanted to see my thoughts behind when those 2 cards were restricted. I know why the cards were restricted. And I don't think it would really be a crazy benefit to just undoing what you've already done. So I would leave these restricted, but I think they are both very safe to unrestrict if you wanted to. I, of course, personally believe that the play patterns of Urza Saga were extremely good for the format in terms of slowing it down, making you play creature removal. The cards that interact with Saga were fun and interesting to me, at least. Playing Dress Down, I thought was very, very nice play pattern. I thought that Saga made for longer games, made for people to play removal, made for people to play artifact removal and enchantment removal, which I think is something that some players don't really like, but I've never really been opposed to. Legacy players get all up in arms if they play like a Pyroblast in the main. Vintage players seem to get up in arms if you play like a Nature's Claim or Fragmentize in the main, but these are like super reasonable cards to include when you look at what cards are strong in the format. Vexing Bauble I don't think is at the power level of a restricted card, but I know why it was restricted, and I think the reasoning why it was restricted is fine. Giving players more opportunities to play the format and do what they came to do makes sense to me. I don't think that Vexing Bauble, did the thing that like Chalice was doing. Chalice was part of a really broken sphere-based shop stack, and you could stack Chalices on top of each other to really prevent your opponent from ever casting spells. Vexing Bauble was not like that. It inherently was only really stopping some pretty broken cards like Black Lotus and Force of Will and Force of Negation. And I actually kind of liked the fact that you were turning off the ability. There was actually some really strong counterplay to these forces. But that being said, I think what's done is done, and they should be left there for probably forever. I still think an unrestricted Saga somewhere down the line would make sense to me, but I don't see them reversing their stance. And obviously there was lots of people who didn't enjoy either of these 2 cards. So yeah, I'm going to leave them both in the safe column. You could totally unrestrict them right now, and the format would be either the same or slightly better, slightly wider. But we don't really do that, right? So this ends up being our final list here. Obviously, Ponder has already come off and was very safe. Yeah, I think this looks good. This is pretty similar. So this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 11 cards that I would look to possibly unrestrict. And obviously, like I said before, the order in which these cards comes off matter. Which cards are coming off matter. Some of these cards have high levels of synergy with each other. Narset and some of the wheel effects, for instance. Simply any card that is blue. That being said, you know, that's a kind of a topic for a different discussion, is how would you go about unrestricting these? In what order would you unrestrict these? The committee or the BNR folks have said that they don't want to do all the unrestrictions at one time. They want to drip feed unrestrictions to be able to produce these spikes in interest, which I fully agree with. So I think you have two approaches then. You either start with all these super safe cards that are interesting. So like you do library, let's do Channel 1 month, we'll do Seal 1 month, Thorn 1 month, Windfall 1 month. You just do all the very safe ones first. Maybe not, 1 month at a time or whatever. There's a lot of room to play around in the specifics of that. Or I think something that might be likely is if you want to try to push for a little nudge to the format to see if you can get the format away from always playing Luris in blue. And so for that would be, I would think at the end of the mock cycle, after everyone plays the full quarter, I would then look at something like a Mentor and a Narset and a Thorn all at the same time to see if those cards push the needle in any way on what the format is currently looking like. I think those are two different kind of styles of unrestriction. One are these more of these PR format interest drivers, things like Channel and Library and Seal and Windfall and Jar and maybe Merchant Scroll. I'm still not sold on the Merchant Scroll. You've got Yawgmoths Will, Mind's Desire. Those are obviously the more risky ones that you would probably do at the very end. But that drip feed of interest of cards that are likely not to impact the format, but will produce interesting brews and attempts for a short amount of time. And then you also have the other option of, well, which of these cards are we going to try to unrestrict to help improve the format? And from what I can tell, that's kind of more the direction that they're going. It's not like we saw all of the, squirrel nest unrestrictions in Legacy. What we saw were 4 unbans in Modern that were very pointed at 1, nostalgia, and 2, reviving archetypes and trying to increase diversity. So I think you're more likely to see things like Narset and Thorn as like the very most likely things that the committee or the ban restriction group would target first. But there are other splashy options for, Ponder and Fast Bond, I think, are things like Channel and Library and Seal, where they were, throwing a bone and trying to drive interest and freeing a nostalgic and powerful old card. So, obviously, everyone has different opinions on this. I'm, of course, very happy to hear yours in the comments below. Let me know where you had strong disagreements. Let me know if there were some cards that you want to see unrestricted. Hopefully not for personal deck building reasons, but just overarching. We'll see. Hopefully we'll be back to playing Magic the Gathering Online in the next video. Please, hopefully they fix the issues by then. If not, I will find another interesting topic to talk to you about in regards to Vintage. New videos Monday, Wednesday, Friday on this YouTube channel. I'll see you then.